Okay guys, so I'm going to walk you through how to approach a poem. You may have done this in school, it may have been a while, or you may never have really done this before. So that's why I wanted to provide a guide for you. I have a video version right here, and then I've also uploaded the PowerPoint just as a regular PowerPoint so you can go back and refer to it as need be. So the first thing you want to do when you get a poem is you want to do a quick overview. So you want to look at things like the number of lines, how it's broken down, is it in a particular shape, are there a certain number of syllables, lines, and then you want to look at things like the title, author, and general subject. So the poem I have here for you is from Emily Dickinson, and it's a very famous poem. It's talking about sort of the merits of her writing and her poetry. And if you know Dickinson, you know she had a very lonely life, and she was a female, of course, which was very difficult. She made a name for herself as one of the very few female poets. And so you want to think about how their influence sort of creates certain context for the poem. And then if I look at this, I see there's 8 lines. I know that it's not a particular format. If I saw 14 lines with a rhyming couplet at the end, then I know it was a sonnet or something like that. You want to look at the 3 S's as well: speaker, situation, and syntax. So first, look at who the narrator is and who are they talking to. Look also at the context, the setting, so situation. In Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, for example, the woods are dark and deep, it's nighttime, all of this contributes to the message of the poem. And then lastly, you want to look at the choice of words. Is it formal, informal, colloquial? Did they choose a certain dialect? Do they use incomplete sentences versus complete sentences? There's a reason. All of these words are carefully chosen because poems are usually much shorter than, obviously, a narrative. So I've given you an example here. We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks. And We Real Cool is set in, Harlem Renaissance, 1940s Harlem. So if you read with that context in mind, you get a different meaning than if you thought this was, say, a modern poem. And it's we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. So if you're just guessing from this what the subject matter is, you can understand a bit of context. You can understand this is about people who sort of live the hard and fast life, probably teenagers or young adults, people who do gamble and drink and smoke and listen to jazz and basically live life a little bit on the edge, and how all of this living is going to result very quickly in dying. So it's a very powerful short poem. It's a very famous poem as well. You're going to look also at sound. So this is what you're probably used to when you think about poetry. The very best thing you can do is to read it out loud. This is the only way that you can hear versus see the words. If you only read this poem, you would have a very different interpretation than you would hearing the way the beats go and hearing the sound of the language. So the things you want to look at are rhyme, rhythm, and meter. You want to look at any types of repetitions or refrains, and the emotional tone of the poem. So rhythm is the flow or the recurring motion of the sounds in the poem. So this is the pauses and the stresses. So for example, Two Roads by Robert Frost, I wouldn't read it as two roads diverged in a yellow wood. I would read it in a yellow wood and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler long I wouldn't read it like that. I would read with the natural pauses and see where he makes those breaks. So for example, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So that division between wood and that he's made on purpose, it signals that he has a new thought or an additional thought to add on to the one before. So that's a very purposeful thing, and I'm not going to go through it in extent right now, but you want to look also at rhyme. So rhyme can take place in a couple different ways. This is just a few. An end rhyme is what you're probably used to. That's what we have here, where would, stood, and could rhyme. Both and growth rhyme, and they're all at the ends of the lines. Internal rhymes happen obviously within the poem. So it'd be something like, I go to school, I know a lot now. Go and know would rhyme in between. And that was a very bad example, but you get the picture. So then we think about meter. Meter is the measured number of syllables and the way that they're arranged. So iambic, you've heard of, I'm sure, iambic pentameter, but iambic itself is the arranging of the stress on the second word of each pair. So that time of year thou mayest in me behold. Trochaic comes from having the stress on the first word of each pair. So it would be tell me not in mournful numbers. And the way you do this best is by beating it out with your hand. So you tap on the desk and you can follow along. You say, that time of year thou mayest in me behold. When you add in the number of syllables, that's where you get the meter. So you see this little dash right here. You would put a dash between each pair, and then you would show how many pairs there are. So that's the syllables. So right here, for example, I would put a dash between mourn and full, or say it was in mourn. I know that's not the case, but say that's the case. You would put a dash here, even though it splits up the word, and that's okay. So, for example, iambic pentameter has 10 syllables and 5 iambs, or 5 pairs. So I know that the line would go that time, that's one pair. Of year, there would be another line. Thou mayest, you get it. A trochaic tetrameter has 4. Tetra means 4, right? So you would say, tell me, and you do it, not in, and there'd be a line there. Mournful, and numbers. So hopefully that makes sense. When you hear people say I'm a pentameter, now you know what they mean exactly. You also want to look at repetition and refrain. So sometimes you'll have a repeated element or word. So for example, in "Oh Captain, my Captain," you have the words captain repeated over and over again. You also can have repeated lines or sections, so that would be called a refrain. So repetition is just elements, refrain is when you have whole sections or lines repeated. And then lastly, you want to look at the emotional tone. So examine how the piece is written. Is it celebratory? Is it mournful? Is it epic? Etc. You also want to examine basic literary elements. This is where the meat of a poetry analysis essay usually comes from. So it's just like any bit of literature. You want to look at things like symbolism, imagery, metaphors, similes, hyperboles. An extended metaphor, by the way, in poetry is called the conceit. So I've given you Fire and Ice here by Robert Frost. It's a very famous poem. So some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. So just from those first 2 lines, we have a literal representation of fire and ice, meaning the sun would explode and not explode, but the sun would expand so much that it literally burns our world out. And you think about the context and the time period this was written in, or that the sun would cease to burn and that our world would become ice and we would have a second ice age and everyone would become extinct. But you also have the symbolic meaning of it. So fire here meaning, you could take it as fire meaning the end of the world through sort of nuclear weaponry or eventual World War Type 3, or ice would be where we sort of lose something and we eventually burn ourselves out and sort of freeze ourselves by losing our ability to farm food or something like that. That's just one way you could take it. There's a lot of different ways. You also want to look about division and form. So think about how the poem is written. Think about, is it divided up by stanzas? Is it quatrains? Do some of the lines bleed over into the next line? That's called enjambment when they do, versus an end stop, which is where they don't do that. And then form. Think about the types of writing the poem has. So is it free verse, meaning doesn't rhyme or doesn't always rhyme in the same way, versus verse, which is where you have, much like in Two Roads. Sonnets, of course, haikus, you've heard of these different types of poems. So that's where the last thing you want to look at as far as form goes. The very last thing you want to look at is how this poem fits within a particular time period of movement, perhaps, and how the poets background or biography or contribution to the movement fits. So this is Langston Hughes, for example. You guys have read Thank You, Ma'am from him. So you know about Langston Hughes and Harlem Renaissance and the function of music and the blues and all of this in his writing. So if I had you read, say, Sonny's Blues, which is not by him, but Sonny's Blues, it's a Harlem Renaissance piece, you would understand the function of music and Harlem and how important all of that was to the poem as you read it. So it added a different contextual level of meaning to the poem. So that's just a quick run through. Like I said, I've put just the regular PowerPoint as well on here so you can refer to it if need be. And now I'm going to have you guys go ahead and try it, and then you're going to move on to your next thing.